Welcome to this CEIE virtual webinar on a spiritual Hippocratic oath to the LGBTQIA+ community with Bruce Knotts. My name is John Malcolmson, and I am the CEIE coordinator, and I use he and him pronouns. We are grateful to be here in Seattle on the land of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people who have stewarded this land for countless generations. We are aware that acknowledgement is not enough and commit to the continued efforts of repair. The Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University is committed to providing all kinds of rich opportunities for communities and students who are both very near and far away. Through hybrid, virtual, and in-person formats, we work with partners to create events, workshops, and educational offerings, such as this webinar and our monthly webinar series. We are grateful to have you with us as we imagine and shape this experience together. By the way, we are recording this event so those who are unable to attend can watch it online. Today, we welcome Bruce Knotts, Director of the Unitarian Universalist Office at the United Nations. I am handing this over now to CEIE Director, Dr. Michael Reed-Trice, who will moderate our webinar.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the country and in the world. It is my pleasure to introduce Bruce Knotts. I'll say a number of things about Bruce, and then after that, we will continue with about 15 to 20 minutes where we'll invite Bruce to make a number of comments, his presentation on the theme, how we understand a spiritual Hippocratic oath to the LGBTQIA+ community. And then after that, we'll engage in conversation. I'll engage Bruce in some conversation, some back and forth on what we feel are some elemental questions that need to be asked that will give you all an opportunity to kind of construct your own questions and inquiries that you have. We invite you to do that at any time, as our coordinator, John Malcolmson, has just noted. Place that into the chat, and right around the 50-minute mark on the hour, we will start engaging those questions too. So I'll read those questions at that time, and then we'll respond to those. We'll ask Bruce to respond to those. So having said all of that, let me begin first with an introduction of our colleague and friend, Bruce Knotts. Bruce was a Peace Corps volunteer early on in Ethiopia and worked for Raytheon in Saudi Arabia from 1976 to 1980, and on a World Bank contract in Somalia from 1982 to 84, before he joined the Department of State as a U.S. diplomat in 1984. Bruce had diplomatic assignments in Greece and Zambia, India, Pakistan, Kenya, Sudan, Cote d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast, and the Gambia, where he served as Deputy Chief of Mission. While in the Cote d'Ivoire, Bruce served as the U.S. government's Regional Refugee Coordinator for West Africa. Bruce worked closely with several United Nations special representatives at that time and observed UN peacekeeping operations in Sierra Leone from 2000 to 2003. He retired from the Foreign Service in 2007 and then began directing the Unitarian Universalist Association office at the United Nations in New York, starting in 2008. Bruce founded faith-based advocacy for sexual orientation and gender identity around human rights at the United Nations, and continues to advocate for the rights of women, indigenous peoples, and for sustainable development in moral terms of faith and values to this day. Bruce is frequently invited to speak on various topics at venues on these topics and more around the world, including recently in the United States at Columbia University, for instance, where he'll be speaking about that for a moment, in Canada, Mexico, China, the Republic of Korea, Ghana, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam, to name a few. Bruce is adjunct faculty at New York University, teaching a senior policy course on refugees and migration for Masters of Social Work students there. He's also co-chair of the NGO Committee on Human Rights at the United Nations and chair of the NGO Committee on Disarmament, Peace, and Security. He's a member of the NGO Security Council Working Group, and he chaired the NGO DPI Executive Committee from 2015 to 2019, representing DPI-affiliated NGOs in the United Nations. And if you don't know what DPI is as a listener, don't worry. We're going to ask Bruce to just define that acronym in a moment. Bruce is a trustee, finally, at the Parliament of the World's Religions, where he loves to serve, I know he's told me, and he serves as the co-moderator as well, equally with a certain amount of affection, and the Steering Committee of Religions for Peace, USA. He's a commissioner for the Buddhist Tzu Chi Foundation, and in 2006, Bruce and Isaac Humphrey were wed in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. Isaac works internationally as a venue manager for New York Fashion Week, is an event environmentalist, photographer, and a social media consultant. And Bruce is a dear friend of all of ours. Having said all of that, Bruce, we welcome you to this presentation on the theme. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we invite you to speak with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be here. And thank you for that beautiful introduction. You mentioned Isaac, and let me just mention that he says that my job is to save the world and his job is to make it look pretty. And together we make a good team. So I'm going to dive into this topic of sexual orientation and the Hippocratic Oath, and just mention that sexual orientation and gender identity are firmly determined at birth, or at least within the first year of life. The best comparison that we have is that all of us are born either right-handed or left-handed or ambidextrous. For much of human history, left-handed children were forced to use their right hand. Some were beaten, or others had their left hand strapped to make it unusable. This forcing of left-handers to use their right hand caused emotional problems, stuttering, and other unwanted consequences. Far more draconian efforts are used to pray the gay away or otherwise force gays and lesbians to be attracted to the opposite gender. Lesbian women have been raped by men to force them to be attracted to men. Doesn't work. Gay men have been beaten, in some cases killed. None of these methods work. Why is it so important to some people to change other people's sexual orientation and gender identity? In many cases, it's because the parents or clergy are themselves gay, and by using such draconian methods to punish other gay men and lesbian women, they hope to hide their own sexuality. This was true of my father and of all the men in my history that have made my life miserable. Frederick the Great, who was gay, was beaten, and his lover was killed in front of him when he was a teenager by his father, the King of Prussia, who had sex himself with his own soldiers. Of course, remember Reverend Ted Haggart, president of the National Association of Evangelicals, who preached against homosexuality for years while paying a gay man for sex. It has been my experience that when a man is comfortable with his heterosexuality, he doesn't have a problem with me being gay. It's men who claim to be heterosexual who are in fact attracted to men who are the most vicious against gay men like me, who are out of the closet and open about our sexuality and our relationships. My husband, Isaac Humphrey, means more to me than anything, and our love is the cornerstone of our lives. The love we share is so deep and good that it could never be a sin, nor should it ever be despised. Such love can only be honored and cherished. So what does the Bible say, and why does it say it? There are 6 verses in the Bible which condemn a man for lying with another man as with a woman, which is termed an abomination. These 6 verses are referenced more than the 2,000 verses in the Bible which command us to care for the poor, the orphan, the elderly, and the sick. Why are no verses condemning women lying with another woman as with a man? If lesbianism is not condemned in scripture, how do religious people justify condemning same-sex attraction among women? I don't have an answer to that question, but I know why the Bible condemns men having sex with men. It is because gay men threaten the patriarchy. Above all, the Bible makes it clear that God is a man and that men are the head of the house and must be obeyed. Men are to be the priests and rulers. Patriarchy is emphasized in most religions, and especially in the religions from the Middle East. If a man can be penetrated by another man in much the same way as a woman, then what happens to the dominance of men over our universe? So what's my minimal ask? It's the Hippocratic dictum, do no harm. So let's say you feel that homosexuality is a sin. Jesus said, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Our churches and other places of worship are full of sinners. Many of them are clergy. A friend of mine questioned why we care so much about the sins of the bedroom and not of the boardroom. We tend to ignore most sinners, those who cheat on their income taxes and those who don't always tell the truth, those who neglect the poor, the widows, and the orphans. We save our maximum amounts of hatred for gays and lesbians. Why? My ask is to leave us alone. Treat us like you treat all the other sinners in your place of worship. Mostly you ignore them. Let us live our lives and at least commit no harm until such time as your own heart develops enough to love even the gays and lesbians and trans people among you. There's a wonderful documentary that I hope you watch. It's called For the Bible Tells Me So. And there's a Black family featured in the film in addition to a white family. The Black father says in the film, I prayed to God that my daughter wouldn't be a whore and my son wouldn't be gay. God answered my prayer. My daughter is gay and my son is a whore. Be careful what you pray for. So the starting point of our discussion is to do no harm. Hopefully, as with doctors who commit no harm as the foundation of their profession, if we commit to do no harm, we might, with time, be able to actually do some good. However, we don't need misguided do-gooders who do more harm than good. So the best stance is to do no harm. My husband is a Black man. He feels the same way about racial bigotry. More than anything, he wants to be left alone. If you don't like my sexual orientation, then go on about your business and leave me alone. If you don't like that I'm married to a Black man, and believe me, there are many people that are really upset about that, including in my family, then go on about your business and leave us alone. Commit to doing no harm. And that's the message that we have for us today and that we will continue to discuss. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks for those comments and for the clarity of your position. There's no doubt about the specifics or where your particular stance is. I do want to ask you a number of questions then about some of these themes as we've discussed, and in particular, and I think they're very much kind of around the arc of many of the comments that you've made, and as you've mentioned, to do no harm in particular. And we've had significant conversation over the years about the Hippocratic Oath, and with regard to a spiritual Hippocratic Oath. But I think that's compelling as an image. Could you tell those in the room, first, what is the Hippocratic Oath that you have in mind with regard to the LGBTQIA plus community? And second, what is the spiritual Hippocratic Oath beyond doing no harm that you have in mind and that you're significantly concerned about in your work?
Well, I think I mentioned this in my remarks, and it's the vision that we have in the scriptures of a bunch of people who are about ready to stone a woman who I guess was considered to be a harlot or having sex that wasn't allowed. And before people started to throw stones at her, Jesus said, "He who was without sin cast the first stone." And it's this idea that there's an arrogance in people that think they have the God-given right to judge my life and my marriage and what I do, or judge other people. And it's this idea that I think Jesus was talking about in this message that he gave is, who are you to cast the first stone? Are you so sinless and you are so perfect that you can cast a stone at this woman that you probably don't even really know? And yet people feel perfectly fine in casting stones at gays and lesbians and trans people, most of whom they don't know. They don't know our lives, and they don't know what we've gone through to come to terms ourselves with our sexuality or our gender identity. It's always a very difficult road. It's never something easy. And then when somebody comes and casts verbal stones or in some case physical stones, it's just adding insult to injury. We've already been injured in a lot of ways just trying to grow up in homes that are often not very friendly to us because of our sexual orientation or gender identity. And we don't need to go to a place of worship and find even more stones cast at us. I was brought up in the Church of Christ. I was actually studying for the ministry in the Church of Christ. I gave that up because I knew there was no way I could be a Church of Christ minister as a gay man. I couldn't be a Church of Christ minister today as a gay man all these years later. And I wandered from church to church and from denomination to denomination until I finally found the Unitarian Universalists, who welcomed me and my husband. And there are a lot of really good people that are leaving a lot of our houses of worship because they don't feel welcome and they feel like they're being judged. And I would say it's in the interests of our places of worship and also in the interests of the people who are there not to judge. And again, the Bible says that, judge not that ye be not judged. And over again, I hear Christians saying, well, we're judging the sin, not the sinner. Well, that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says, judge not that ye be not judged, and they don't make any caveats there.
Well, let me give a retort a little bit and have you respond to that as well. We live in a time, as we know, where we have lots of ideological differences. We can see that there are those distinctions show up with how the very verses that you're representing are read differently. And there's a kind of balkanization. We see it politically, we see it religiously in the United States, but not only there. We're looking at the rise of hate groups, as you well know, in other areas of the world, in India, in Brazil, in the UK, and in other locales. And last night we internationally recognized Kristallnacht, and it's in those times where one community can look at another and justify some pretty abhorrent behavior in the name of sacred text, in the name of a kind of core rationality, and can find the adversary or enemy and justify all kinds of impunity against them. So this sense of a spiritual or a Hippocratic oath assumes something about a shared values that we have, that you and I have, that we both value the lives, the bodies of those who are members of the LGBTQIA community. Are you concerned? And if so, what is that signal for the future, that we don't any longer have that kind of shared fabric? And does that make us more vulnerable around these issues? And does it make this community more vulnerable? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Kristallnacht, because I think that's a very important point that we need to look at. And again, I'm going to quote Jesus. It's my Church of Christ background. I did a lot of Bible study. But when Jesus' disciples said that, you know, you have to take care of the you haven't taken care of me, you haven't fed me when I need to be fed. And the disciples said, when didn't we give you to food? When didn't we take care of you? And he said, when you didn't do it to the least of these, you didn't do it to me. You didn't take care of me. And it's this idea, unless we treat the least of these as we want to be treated ourselves, then we're at fault. And what often happens, as certainly happened with the Jews in Germany, they were vulnerable. They were an easy target. And so the Nazis made them a target and used them as a way to gain their own power and prestige. Often it's LGBT people, or it's Black people, or it's women. It's whoever is considered the most vulnerable in your group. Attacking them is a way to give yourself power and authority. And we certainly see that in the United States now. Ron DeSantis, who won a huge victory as governor of Florida, and the people were chanting 2 more years, making it very clear that they expect him to run for president. He talked about he wants to get rid of woke culture. And he said that over and over again. And what does that mean? Primarily, in the laws that he's passed, is not to talk about being gay in the schools, not to teach people about the very thing that I just said in my opening remarks about the fact that sexual orientation and gender identity are basically established very firmly at birth, or at least within the first year of life. That's the kind of information Ron DeSantis does not want taught in the schools. The other thing he doesn't want taught in the schools is that this nation has a history of slavery, and we've enslaved people, and we had our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, and we talked about, all men are created free and equal. We didn't mean all men, because we didn't mean people of color. We certainly didn't mean women, because women didn't have the right to vote. So, we need to really look at our history of enslavement and what we do even today. People, Black men like my husband, are far more likely to be killed by the police than I am. And I see this all the time. So again, it's taking the least of these, the weakest among us, whether it's based on race or immigration status or sexual orientation or gender identity or whatever it is, and to pile on the abuse on those people so that you can get elected and be very, beat your chest and say, I'm against woke culture. Well, woke just means being informed about all the things that in our life, like the slavery that we have is still part of our history. Slavery is still on the books in several states. Some states are trying to get rid of the idea that it's okay to take incarcerated people and treat them like slaves. Louisiana is one of the states that won't.
Well, and this brings up a direct correlation with regard to the fact that 35% of members of the United Nations still find homosexuality illegal. And member states, fewer than 30 countries, recognize same-sex marriage. That's a true statistic for the United Nations as well. I'd like you to comment on that, if you will, as you're thinking about a response. But I want to also note in your earlier comments, thank you for those. It seems to me fundamentally, as I'm hearing you, that the differences around a sense of the commons, or a social contract, are not just a matter of a difference of opinion, as I hear what you're saying in the examples you've named, but rather that there are emerging fundamental differences that we see on how we understand human anatomy, anthropology, history, psychosociology, and morality. And perhaps that's incredibly concerning, because opinions are kind of somewhat more superficial compared to how we think about the fundamental rootedness of our humanity when we think of what is a human being, which is an anthropological, question. What do you make of the fact that 35% of UN member states still find homosexuality illegal? And what does that suggest about the international community's response to some of these same issues?
Well, it's something I've spent the past 15 years trying to work on at the United Nations. It's been a core part of the work that we've done, and at least we've gotten the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to emphasize that we are all born equal in dignity and rights, and that includes people based on their sexual orientation, gender identity. There were resolutions passed by the Human Rights Council in 2009. There's a treaty which obligates us all to not discriminate based on race, color, creed, nationality, and other status. It comes at the tail end of the statement is and other status. So the two resolutions that were passed by the Human Rights Council in 2009 with and other status also includes sexual orientation, and the second resolution also includes gender identity, which means that we're also included in that idea that you can't discriminate against us because of our sexual orientation or gender identity. But if you look at the 35 countries or so that still do not accept sexual orientation or gender identity, they're not the places you normally would want to live. They're not democratic. They're not, as they're not recognizing the human rights of people based on their sexual orientation and gender identity, they're also not recognizing the human rights of women. One of those countries that's chief among the countries that don't accept LGBT people is Iran. And you've got women now demonstrating because they're not being treated fairly. And I've been saying this for years now, that we're the kind of the canaries in the coal mine. If we are being persecuted in a country, be rest assured that other minorities won't be far behind. And it's the same, I mean, the example you gave with Kristallnacht, I think it was Martin Niemöller who said, first they came for the Jews and I didn't say anything, and then they came for the socialists, and then they came for the communists, and I didn't say anything, and then they came for me, and there was nobody left to say anything for me. Mm-hmm. So unless we stand up for the least of these, even the people we might even despise, but to recognize even the people we despise are human beings, and they also have the inherent worth and dignity of everyone else. And unless we stand up for them, sooner or later, the chopping block will come to us, and it always does. And what we're seeing across the world and here in the United States is growing authoritarianism and growing intolerance. And the more that grows, I mean, we might, be spared from, having the axe fall on us this year or next year. But if that authoritarianism and that intolerance grows as it did in Nazi Germany, it will engulf everybody in the end.
I wonder if, based on your comments, if the failure to stand up in the ways that you're describing for the neighbor is also an error of omission and like a moral omission. I'm not standing up. That what I'm doing is giving a kind of tacit permission to the powers and capacities of those authoritarian principalities to exact their will in the world. So what do you do? And I want to go back to this question of the Hippocratic Oath as well. Is there something, do you think, in society? And you've mentioned, and we've talked about those countries that don't recognize the rights of homosexual peoples, but there's something about the trans community in particular that issues in a particular vulnerability today that seems to be especially vulnerable at the level of policy. Could you speak to that, or what is your impression of whether that's true or not, what I'm saying?
The whole dichotomy of sexual orientation and gender identity is very interesting because it's different in different parts of the world. So in the East, in India, Pakistan, and Iran, there is this concept of the hijrans in South Asia, which are basically trans women. And they're definitely despised. They're definitely, they don't get the opportunities for jobs or education, but they're absolutely required at every wedding because they're considered good luck. So they tend to dance at weddings. So they're part of society and they're kind of recognized. Iran also has, they will actually pay for gender reassignment surgery or gender rectification surgery for men to be trans. Again, as they're trans, they don't get jobs, they don't get education, they're despised, but there's a recognition that there's legitimacy to being trans in that part of the world. And in fact, trans people in Europe, which is considered to be progressive, and Europe, of course, was very quick to accept same-sex marriage and sexual orientation, it's been much slower, and trans people have been persecuted in places like England and Norway and Sweden, which are very progressive countries and been very progressive on sexual orientation. It's taken a longer time for people to accept trans people. And that's the case here in the United States as well. Sexual orientation is far more tolerated and accepted here in the United States than trans people are. And I don't quite know what it is, you know, but there's a resistance in Western culture to trans people that seems not to exist in Eastern culture, which seems to accept trans as a legitimate form of being, even if they're despised and not given the same opportunities, but they're considered part of society. They're not considered, you know, as not part of society. They're part of society, but in a lower state. I'm not trans myself. It's taken me a long time to understand what it's like to be trans. But in my many, many conversations with trans people, they grow up the same way that I grew up. I had feelings of attraction to boys, to men, you know, from my childhood. And, you know, when I was even studying my Bible books and, you know, we had Adam and Eve, I was always much more attracted to Adam than I was to Eve. And this is what trans people tell me too, is that when they are very young, you know, toddlers and growing up as young children, they feel that the gender they were assigned at birth is not their true gender. And it's a very deep feeling. And it stays with them, and it's there very early on in their growth. So in that sense, there's a similarity of the beginnings of this feeling of gender identity and sexual orientation. It happens at the beginning of life, really, and it stays with us. And there's no way of praying it away or psychoanalyzing it away. It's just there, and you know, my says, just accept it, accept them from who they are. And yeah, my Hippocratic oath is leave them alone, leave us alone. But it is more than that. For example, if you see a police officer beating up on a Black man, what is your obligation? I would say your obligation is to go over and tell that police officer to stop. And I think even with Derek Chauvin, who had his knee on George Floyd's neck, there were people that told him to stop. There should have been more aggressive action to tell him to stop. So it's not just enough to leave us alone. If you see us under threat and somebody's abusing us because of who we are, there is an obligation to stop the abuse. If you see the abuse, you need to say something and stop it if you can. And so it's not just leaving us alone, but it's also taking action to make sure that other people leave us alone and allow us to live our lives.
I wonder if as I'm asking this next question, if those who are also listening in and kind of around the circle of this conversation would give some consideration in their own lives to this particular question, which is, there's something about the capacity and centrality of empathy and like having an emotional IQ in your comments, an empathy IQ that can be foiled pretty quickly by the form of authoritarianism you were talking about before. This kind of, zero sum, it's either ones or zeros, it's either wrong or right. Now you mentioned the word binary, black or white, it's truth or it's false, which seems to kind of get in the way, deconstruct our capacity to just simply take other human beings on their own terms, which is what I hear you saying. It doesn't mean I have to agree with them, but empathy itself, the capacity to believe that the stories that others bring, their subjective lives, are not determined by anything I believe about their stories themselves. It humanizes them. If I don't approach with empathy, if a society forgets the healing importance of empathy, what happens? What happens to us? Is there anything else that could fill in where empathy is absent in a society that's moving toward authoritarianism?
I don't know that there's any substitute for empathy. I think it's something that definitely needs to be cultivated, and it needs to be institutionalized.
How do you do that?
And well, I don't know. It's a good question, but certainly what I think you're referring to and what I see also is a deinstitutionalization of empathy. This is a very zero-sum world, and if there's black and white, and there's right and wrong, and there's red state and blue states, and we're putting ourselves in boxes, and it's no empathy. I mean, it used to be, certainly when I was growing up, that a Catholic would never consider marrying a Protestant.
Right.
Nowadays, a Republican would never consider marrying a Democrat. I mean, we've become so polarized. And one example that I give often is that I was at a dinner party in 2016, so it was the election year for Donald Trump. And there was a woman who was a Unitarian Universalist, a very good friend of ours. And the other people at the table were telling her she was all kinds of bad things for being a Trump supporter. And she was so abused that she got up, out, and she ran out of the apartment and ran away. And I ran after her. And I told her, I said, I love you and you're my friend. And I hate to see you crying like this. And even if you vote for Donald Trump, you're still my friend and I still love you. That's the kind of empathy that we need. We need to be able to take somebody who we violently disagree with and still see them as a human being and still love them. And that's kind of what I was saying in my remarks about sexual orientation, gender identity. If you don't like it, if you think there's something not quite right about being gay or being trans, fine, think however you want to think, but still recognize us as human beings. And even if you don't like, that I'm married to a black man, still see us as human beings and love us as you're supposed to, as your religion tells you to love us, and defend us and take care of us when we're in need, because that to me is the essence of religion. And if you're not able to do that, then we are in our boxes, and we are going to face a very terrible fate as a world and as a country. What we need is more empathy, less, because we've got climate change. We're going to have more migrants. There are going to be people leaving their countries because of war, because of climate change, because of many things. And we should be welcoming people. And we actually have the jobs, we have the space, we can welcome people. And if we're not doing it, then where's our humanity?
Well, and I wonder, there's a lot to be considered in that, right? How do we understand the nature of a sovereign state after the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648? There's a lot that determines how we understand modernity that will have to be reconsidered to have empathy have such a structural impact. But I do think as well that there are areas of hope, to your point. I mean, if there's any fundamental service that any member of the trans community could provide to their given nation, it would be in the military. And we do have a timeline of countries that have established the right for transgender individuals to serve, starting with the Netherlands in 1974, and Sweden in 76, Norway in 79. I'm skipping a few. The Czech Republic in 99, 2003, Belgium, and Bolivia, the latest in 2010. In short, we do have a list of hopeful places in the world where that kind of fundamental service has been opened up to those of the trans community. That's a signal of hope. What is another signal of hope that you see amidst this topic, that you believe as a bellwether for how things could go if we're paying attention to the rights and kind of structural empathy toward those of the trans community today?
I mean, there is growing acceptance of trans people and of people of different sexual orientation. And you mentioned 35 countries that are against us, but there's a lot of countries that are for us, and that is growing. And I think there's greater and greater acceptance. Even I think there's a lot more pressure even on places like Egypt, for example, and they're now hosting COP27. They have had to accept everybody at that COP, whether they're gay or straight or trans or, whatever religion they are, they have to accept everybody. Some athletic competitions, there have been countries that don't want to accept LGBT people. If you remember the Sochi Olympics, I think the German Olympic team all came in rainbow colors. I mean, there was a great deal of pressure put on Russia because of its anti-LGBT stance. And so I think there's a greater internationalism and an international awareness that it just isn't cool to discriminate against people because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. It doesn't mean that all the problems are solved, but I think and it's the same on race. I mean, racism used to be absolutely accepted, to say the N-word, to treat people horribly, not to have Black people on television or in the movies. All of that was perfectly acceptable until it wasn't anymore. Mm-hmm. And not that the problems have gone away, because they certainly haven't. People are killed because they're Black in this country, far more than white people. So we still have a lot of problems, but I think there's a lot of recognition and more empathy. I think we begin to see the other person as a human being. And the more we emphasize that in international discourse and meetings that we have around the world, in athletic competitions, the more that we recognize the humanity of all of us, I think we're headed in the right direction. But when we're headed in the other direction and we don't see the humanity in others, the trajectory that almost always takes place is that while you're discriminating against a weak minority, it winds up with everybody facing brutality and totalitarianism.
I want to change the direction a little bit now in the remaining moments that I have to ask you questions, and then we're going to open this up to the room and have some questions in the Q&A section there. I mentioned the chat earlier. I meant the Q&A, and I would encourage those of you listening, if you haven't asked a question or made a comment, now's a great time. And it can be you might say I don't quite have the kind of formulation of what I'd like to say, and I say just have the courage to be. I think it's really important to get your thoughts out, and Bruce will respond to those and interpret those and give it some airtime. So please take the time to do that. Let me in light of this now ask the next question, which I think is near and dear to all of our hearts, and that is our youth in this country, in the United States by that I mean, but also around the world. And we know, because the statistics are showing us in studies both nationally, that is in the US, and internationally, that the pandemic has had a significantly adverse effect on the mental health of youth in general, but in particular, it has also been detrimental to those youth who are claiming the LGBTQIA plus community, and in gender affirming care for transgender and non-binary youth associated with changes in depression, anxiety, and suicidality is strong. So 1 in 4, for instance, in this group between the ages of 13 to 20 has seriously considered or attempted a suicide. These stats are bearing out in an endemic of a mental health crisis that is taking place now, and psychotherapists and clinicians and others in hospitals that had to open wings to take care of this very vulnerable segment of our population. It's very serious. And discrimination and bias, as the tests show, just heaps on this stress, which is researchers are saying, which is one of the reasons why the suicidality, directly proportionate, is so high. Okay, we're looking at these stats together. It's terrible, Bruce. What do we do about this? If there's ever a time for empathy, there's so many different ways to go with this. These are our kids we're talking about. It's not just a political issue. It's not just a theoretical issue. How do you respond to the issue of health and this community for our kids?
It really requires a lot of deep thinking and diving deep into our spirituality. And the pandemic has been tough. It's been tough on everybody. And it's what we're asking for here is, while you're dealing with the pandemic and you're dealing with all of the consequences of the pandemic, we're asking you to dig deeper for more empathy and more care and more compassion than maybe you were able to provide even when things were better. And that's hard. But it's necessary because, people that are vulnerable because they're trans, because of their sexual orientation, or for any number of reasons. I mean, the support mechanisms, which often are the school that they're going to, or the place of worship that they go to, or the community that they have, when those communities are cut off and you're locked down in your home and all you've got is your television, and you hear some of the nonsense that comes out of that. And the people that should be caring for you are themselves a bit traumatized because of the pandemic. It really requires more, and it's caring for the vulnerable in the midst of a battle, when you're scared yourself, that the bombs are falling near to you. And yet, you're being asked to help the poor person, or the indigent person who needs help. And it takes more, and it's hard, and it's going to be hard. I don't see things getting happier and nicer as time goes on. We do have climate change, and the experts agree, COVID is not going away. It's here to stay. It will be with us. And there probably will be other pandemics and plagues that will come they will come later. So we're going to be facing some really tough situations that will challenge all of us. And do we meet these challenges by becoming angrier and more, losing our compassion and losing our empathy, or do we try to increase our empathy and compassion and take care of each other? Because the only way we're really going to survive this and get through this in any kind of decent shape is if we all take a lot of care for each other and dig down deep and care more for each other than we perhaps may have done in easier times. The harder the times become, the more care and compassion we need to do. And there are examples in World War II, World War I, where people actually went the second mile and helped people that they might not even know, but just seeing people in need, people would reach out. It's that kind of compassion and empathy that we need, and it's not going to be easy.
This brings up to the first question with regard to compassion around the world. We faced so much before. What is the world so afraid of, given your experience? We faced a lot of challenges before. What is the world so afraid of now? What's the problem? Why are we so afraid?
I think a lot of people are afraid of change, and I would invite people to embrace change. For one thing, there's really nothing we can do to stop things from changing. I know when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity, and I'm 73 years old, so I come from the generation where a man was a man and a woman was a woman, and and now we don't even know, everybody's non-binary, and what's going on with the world. And people get very kind of disoriented because what they thought was absolutely solidified, and things were not changing, and things are changing. Things are changing dramatically, and we have to keep up with that, and we have to keep up with that with a sense of compassion and empathy as things are changing. And it means getting used to things that you haven't had to deal with before. One of the most pernicious things that are going on in the United States and actually around the world is this replacement theory. This idea that people of color or immigrants are going to replace white people. And this gets a lot of white people very upset and very fragile about their status in the world. And that doesn't help. That really doesn't help. White people need to embrace the fact that, yes, we're going to have a multicultural world, and there are going to be people from different backgrounds and different religions, and we need to embrace that rather than be fearful of it. If we fight it and we're afraid of it, we're just going to make things worse. And if we embrace the other and embrace people that are different than ourselves, we have the chance of really getting through this in some sort of decent shape.
Second question, almost 30 countries have legalized same-sex marriage. How concerned are you that legalized same-sex marriage in the United States would be threatened?
Well, Clarence Thomas has threatened it. I think the Supreme Court might threaten it. I don't think it's going to go away. As we're seeing with the abortion ban, many states like New York, where I live, have passed legislation to make sure that abortion remains viable here. Isaac and I moved to New York State because same-sex marriage was recognized in New York State at a time when we used to live in Virginia, where it wasn't recognized in Virginia. So a lot of people moved to states where, things were recognized. So if the Supreme Court were to get rid of same-sex marriage in the United States, which they may do, California, New York, a lot of states will enshrine laws in their state constitutions that will validate same-sex marriage. But it will be a sad thing, and I would expect sooner or later the U.S. Congress will pass legislation that will codify same-sex marriage, as I'm sure they will codify abortion rights. It all comes down, both of these issues come down to this idea, this is my body, this is the body that I've been given, and I get to basically say what I do with my body. I get to say who I love and who I don't love. And a woman certainly should get the chance to decide whether she's going to take a pregnancy to term or not. That should be her decision because it's her body. So it's this whole issue of bodily autonomy that's at stake here. And some people are challenging it. Some people feel that they have the right to tell me what I'm going to do with my body or what women should do with their body. And then other people say, no, that's really none of their business. And that comes back to this Hippocratic oath. I mean, some of it is like, do no harm, stay out of the way, stop meddling in my life and what I'm doing with my body. Just leave me alone is basically all we're asking here.
Let me ask this other question. I think it's, and maybe I'll follow up with a question that could kind of run alongside it for you to consider, which is, that nieces and nephews, and it seems this whole current generation is asking questions, 10 to 15-year-olds asking questions of gender identity and of their own. And that there's kind of a porousness now that this current generation coming up is willing to talk about. What do you think about that? And the second point is to kind of push back a little. What about those parents who say, well, look, we want to instill you with certain values. Those values come from our reading of scripture, of texts, or of the philosophies that have informed us across generations. And now we're really engaging a unique, what feels like a very new perspective on our human identity. And it's hard for me to just step away from that, because it seems like there's a kind of a movable object, sorry, let me say it differently, an unstoppable force that's just kind of coming my way in this generation. And I don't want to just cede all of the, all of those values and that have formed me and formed my grandparents, my great grandparents. How do you respond to those two questions together?
Well, yeah, I think that's kind of the key question here. And, I mean, I'm a gay man. It took me years for me to accept my own sexual orientation. I thought I was wrong. I thought I was sinful. I thought I was told over and over again I was going to go to hell because I was gay. And it took me a long time to come to terms with my own sexual orientation. And I try to be compassionate with other people that maybe haven't come to terms with my sexual orientation, and it may, it can be difficult for people that are not used to it and haven't grown up with it. I remember, and I'm a gay man. I'm kind of in the movement here, and all of a sudden I started hearing, the young people talk about non-binary, and I go, what is that? What do you mean non-binary? But when I started thinking about it, I throughout my entire life, and I think all of us, I've known women that were pretty masculine, and I've known men that were pretty feminine. And, when you start thinking of the whole panoply of people out there, and, when you try to put a gender marker on them, some of them don't fit that well, because there are people that aren't very binary, that do kind of be the gender fluid, and they kind of go back and forth. And, so you see that there's some justice in there. But the first time I heard the term non-binary, I was shocked. And I said, what is that? And it took me a while to get used to it. And, again, I understand religious people having, grown up in a certain way, grown up with their traditions, and caring to keep their religion alive and the values that they were growing up with alive. And I don't have a problem with that as long as you're doing no harm, which it comes back to our basic point here. And if your religion is causing harm, then you really need to change. And I was at the UN, and I was talking to a former special rapporteur on freedom of religion. He was a German guy. And I asked the first question. It's a tip, by the way, when you're in an audience, try to ask the first question, because if you don't get the first one, you might not get a chance after that. And so I asked the question, I said, okay, we all believe in freedom of religion, but what about when religion becomes the oppressor, when religion becomes the persecutor? And I said, the cases that I see religion being a persecutor and oppressor mostly is when it comes to women and when it comes to LGBT people. And so what do you say about freedom of religion in that case? And the UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of religion said, I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but religions need to change. And the fact of the matter is, religions are changing. Now, religions tend to change slowly over time, but most of the religions we've seen have accommodated themselves to more equality for women, more racial equality. they're beginning to reach out and have some kind of equality with people of different sexual orientations or gender identities. And I realize it's hard for religions to change, and you think this is the word of God, but if you actually look at the word of God, there's nothing in any of these scriptures that say that you can be hateful because you don't like somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity. There just isn't. That's not in anybody's scripture. So it means reinterpretation. It means looking at your faith again in a new light. And what scripture does say to me is the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And in fact, I sometimes change that to recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every being, which would include non-human beings, animals, and more.
Maybe it's back to this earlier point about empathy and structural empathy, as you named it. The vulnerability of not having it, the risk of not having enough empathy in society, is that the inherent worth and dignity of the single human life within community is trespassed. Like, just really, as that means in the Latin, just walked over. And I'm curious as well. I know you've seen these statistics. It's one thing to have let's say a youth who comes from a relatively majoritarian culture. Let's say this is a kid from a white family, upper middle class, who comes from the LGBTQIA community. But some of the statistics that we're also reading about mental health around the LGBTQIA community, the pandemic, and those communities that have faced historic discrimination, is that teens who come from communities of color and identify with the LGBTQIA plus community are especially vulnerable. And you've mentioned this before with regard to race and structural racism and increased vulnerabilities. In other words, you can stack upon discrimination one upon the next and create tremendous pressure at this level for this youth. So society has its work on numerous fronts at once. What is your general optimism or hope as you look out nationally and internationally that we are becoming more equipped, or religions are becoming more equipped to deal with the complexities of that form of multiple layered discrimination?
I think a lot of groups that are discriminated against, and I'd say my experience is probably mostly with the Black community, since my husband is Black and I'm aware of his family background. And certainly the ministers that preached in his AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, condemned homosexuality pretty regularly from the pulpit. But there's sort of I think what often happens with oppressed groups is they say, okay, we need to take care of the racial oppression before we start taking care of your oppression based on your sexual orientation and gender identity. So put that aside, and because we need to concentrate on the oppression we're facing because of race. And I mean, you really can't divide stuff up that way. What you basically need to do is end bigotry, period. And it needs to end all bigotry. And like a lot of African-American writers, Michael Dyson, and you know, the list goes on and on and on. Ibram X. Kendi and others have recognized that this is all part of a piece. And yes, we need to get rid of racial bigotry. We also need to get rid of bigotry based on gender identity, sexual orientation, ability or disability. I mean, we need to get rid of all of these bigotries. And to say, you know, we've got to concentrate on the bigotry that I'm mostly concerned about and forget the other ones really isn't the answer. We really need to get rid of all of the bigotries and treat them all with the respect that they deserve. We really can't have a society that it's permissible to be bigoted in some areas and not in other areas. We need to get rid of bigotry altogether.
So let's stay with that for just a moment as well, a little further, because we live, I'm going to say just now for those in the U.S. context, in a country that finds bigotry, I would say, acceptable. We're willing to live with a certain level of historical bigotry unexamined. We're willing to accept that we're not going to investigate that bigotry further, or that level of racial discrimination or discrimination against minoritized populations, and that sets a norm for the country. Or there's a kind of, I'm saying this as a generalization, some may take issue with it, but by and large, that the social fabric, in terms of the status quo, majoritarian status quo would say we're willing to live with that. And yet, what I hear you saying is not so fast. A country that doesn't examine its own bigotries and discriminations won't really be able to be in a position to do the other thing that that you're noting, which is to support really the inherent dignity of all of its citizens and those who are on its shores. So, do we have to address our history in order to really do the current work now? Or can we bypass some of that history and just try to get at the empathy that's necessary today and deal with our history at another time? How would you respond to that?
I say you need to get down with the history. You mentioned earlier that I teach a course on refugees and migration at NYU. I made the 1619 project required reading, and there's not one word in that textbook that talks about refugees and migration. But I said, for you to understand U.S. immigration policy, you have to understand that the United States is a fundamentally racist country and has been from the very beginning. And we tend to lift up the founding fathers, the Supreme Court, textualists say that we have to think of what the founding fathers meant when they wrote the Constitution. And you've got other people that say, those were enslavers. Why are we lifting them up as our guides? And why do we care what they thought when they were writing the Constitution? They were enslavers. And so the only way for us to really make the Constitution valid for today is to not deify these people that were not that very good. They don't deserve the adoration that we've given them historically. And if we examine our history correctly as to what really happened, we need to look at the history for us to understand our present. And we need to understand our present in order to look into the future. But if we continue to hang on to these mythologies that just aren't so, we're in serious trouble. One of the things that I teach in my class is that there was a high court decision in Great Britain in 1773, which said that Magna Carta made it impossible for there to have anybody as a slave in Great Britain. There could not. It was impossible under Magna Carta. That was 1773. The slave owners in the American colonies were really upset by that. And they thought, if this is being enacted in Great Britain, when is that going to come over to us? So 3 years later, Declaration of Independence, 1776, we declare our independence. And the supposition of the 1619 project, it was done to keep slavery going in the United States. So it wasn't for freedom and justice for all. It was to maintain slavery in this country. And for us to understand that, then we can start dealing with why our laws are the way they are and why we have kind of the screwy things on immigration that we have. And we have to deal with our history.
I want to suggest an image to you and then propose now, because I know you have feelings about this as you're framing your own response, that perhaps all we need to do is build awareness. Many people have told you this. For the listener, Bruce and I have had lots of conversation about this. I know you believe we got to do a lot more. And so I want to leave that with you for a moment as you're thinking about that. But let me just suggest to what you, as you're about to respond to that, let me just suggest the following image. To your point, the architect of the Declaration of Independence, for those of you around the table with us, Thomas Jefferson's house, Monticello, even before he died, was visited. It really became just a focal point for visitations, to the annoyance of everyone living there from that day until now, even when it was closed and in a ruin in the early 20th century until this moment where people are walking there. There was something about that place people wanted to go to. It seemed to harbor some form of an ideal that people wanted to have a sense of the architect of the ideals of the American liberty, but largely uninvestigated. Only recently, in the last couple of years, have there been exhibits there that have showcased the real lives of those human beings who were enslaved there. And through empathy, the structural empathy I think you're talking about, Bruce, try to give a 360 to the humanity. And perhaps that's the kind of historical reevaluation, just in a microcosm, that needs to be done at the heart of how we understand the national context. Okay, having said that, Bruce, do we just need to build awareness? Is that what we need to do with regard to having empathy toward the LGBTQIA plus community today in this country and in the world?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. I think some people are very aware. And there's a book, and I meant to get the author of this for this meeting, and I can't. But the name of the book is "The Cruelty is the Point," and if you look it up, you'll find out who the author is. And you've got groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and others here in the United States. They're very aware of what they're doing, and they're very aware of the racial dynamics in this country, and they are doing what they're doing, perfectly aware of how violent they are and the bigotry that they hold. The Nazis were certainly aware. It wasn't like they were living in some kind of fog and they didn't realize they were killing people. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they had a firm intention of, getting rid of the Jewish population of Europe. That was the final solution. So awareness by itself isn't enough. There needs to be a compelling degree of empathy, and I say compelling, which means part of that needs to be part of our legal framework. Mm-hmm. And the legal framework needs to protect the vulnerable. There needs to be consequences when the vulnerable are abused or killed or molested. And the state needs to take a responsibility for their protection if we're going to have a humane state, a humane country that we all want to live in. And we expect our government to protect us. But there are people right now who are willing to use violence. We have far too many guns in this country. I think everybody recognizes that. And I'd say the guns are all in the wrong hands. I've said for years and years, since the Black Panthers, I said, if you gave every Black man a gun in the United States, we would have gun control in this country very quickly. So there are guns in the hands of a lot of white men who are very angry, and they subscribe to this replacement theory, and they don't like it that people that are not white like them are getting jobs and having lives and having homes. That bothers them. So they know, they're very aware, and being aware doesn't make them kinder or nicer. There's more to being to getting that empathy and compassion for others than just being aware of what's going on.
Thank you, Bruce, very much. And we want to thank you for your time. Bruce Knotts, who is the director of the Unitarian Universalist Office at the United Nations, also working, doing consultative work around the country, around the world. And it's our pleasure to host you at the Center for Ecumenical and Interreligious Engagement at Seattle University. We are thrilled that so many of you joined us today for this webinar experience in these hybrid formats where we have an opportunity to learn together. We hope that this opportunity with this time and this topic increased your awareness and your imagination for how together we can be shaped and shape the future of society in ways that are healthy and ways that are inclusive in ways that secure a brighter future for all of us. We wish you peace in your soul and hope that you will share all of the messages from this in hopeful ways with others. We wish you also a happy morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you again for joining, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks again, Bruce.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.